I think it's really quite difficult to follow in your parents' footsteps in the same sport for a variety of reasons. I think that applies in almost any sport you can think of. She's very good. She's very natural and always found it easy to get on with.
The envelope arrived without warning. Princess Anne thought it was just another routine document, but the moment she tore it open, she collapsed against her desk, trembling. Inside was a DNA test that confirmed the impossible. Diana had a secret child, hidden for decades, erased from history. And the name on that report? Someone shockingly close to the royal family. Anne's hands shook as she read it again and again.
When I started my public life 12 years ago, I understood the media might be interested in what I did, but I was not aware of how overwhelming that attention would become.
The morning began like countless others within the walls of Kensington Palace. Princess Anne sat at her desk, working through the usual stack of correspondence that arrived each day. Letters from charities, official documents, ceremonial invitations. Nothing she hadn't seen 1,000 times before. But among the routine paperwork was an envelope that immediately stood out. It bore no official markings, no royal crest, nothing that identified it as part of the formal postal system she was accustomed to. Instead, there was only a deep red wax seal, pressed firmly into the paper, its design unfamiliar to her. For a moment, Anne considered handing it off to her private secretary. That would have been the normal procedure. But something made her pause. Perhaps it was the weight of the envelope, or the unusual seal, or simply an instinct she couldn't quite explain. Whatever the reason, she found herself breaking the seal with her own hands, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. What she saw made her blood run cold. The document was a laboratory report, clinical, precise, and utterly shocking. At the top was a header from a private DNA testing facility. Her eyes scanned down the page, taking in familiar names that seemed impossibly out of place in this context. Diana Spencer. The name alone was enough to make her heart skip, but it was the second name that truly stopped her. A name she had never seen in any official royal record. A name that belonged to someone completely unknown to palace archives. The conclusion was written in language that left no room for misinterpretation. The report confirmed a genetic link between Diana and this unknown individual. Anne read it once, then twice, then a third time, hoping she had somehow misunderstood. But the words remained the same. The science was clear. This wasn't speculation or gossip. It was documented proof of something that should have been impossible. Anne's hands began to tremble as the implications crashed over her. The British monarchy is built on bloodlines, succession, legitimacy. The entire structure of royal authority rests on the clarity and certainty of who belongs to the family and who does not. This report, if genuine, struck at the very foundation of that system. It wasn't just a personal revelation. It had constitutional weight. It could reshape everything. She set the paper down carefully, her mind racing through possibilities. Who had sent this to her? Why now, after all these years? And most disturbing of all, what did this mean for the family she had served her entire life? Anne had always been known as the dependable one, the royal who carried out her duties without complaint or drama. But this was different. This was a crisis she couldn't simply work through with quiet determination. Her thoughts turned to Diana, to conversations they'd had over the years, moments when Diana had seemed to be hinting at something deeper. Anne had often dismissed Diana's more cryptic comments as the words of a woman under enormous pressure, someone struggling with the weight of public scrutiny and private unhappiness. But now those moments came back to her with startling clarity. Had Diana been trying to tell her something? Had there been warnings Anne had simply failed to recognize? She remembered Diana speaking in vague terms about things that couldn't be said aloud, about truths too dangerous to share. At the time, Anne had assumed she was talking about her troubled marriage, or perhaps about the relentless media attention. But what if it had been about this? What if Diana had known about this child and had been trying, in her own careful way, to prepare someone for the day when the truth would emerge? The DNA report sat on Anne's desk like a live grenade. She understood that simply possessing this information put her in an impossible position. The monarchy operates on discretion. Secrets are kept, scandals are managed, and the public face of the family is carefully maintained. But this wasn't the kind of secret that could be managed with a careful statement or a strategic silence. This was proof of a hidden child, someone with royal blood who had been erased from history. Anne thought about the palace's response to Diana when she was alive. The way the institution had treated her concerns, her struggles, her attempts to control her own narrative. Diana had often spoken about the machine, her term for the palace establishment that seemed to operate with cold efficiency, protecting the crown above all else. Anne had thought she understood what Diana meant. But sitting there with the DNA report in her hands, she realized she had only scratched the surface. The question of lineage wasn't just personal, it affected succession. If Diana had another child, someone born outside the acknowledged line, what did that mean for the carefully ordered hierarchy of heirs? The British press had spent decades analyzing every detail of royal births, marriages, and relationships. They had documented William and Harry's every move since infancy, but somehow, if this report was accurate, an entire person had been hidden from view. Anne carefully folded the document and locked it in her private drawer. But even as she turned the key, she knew that the simple act of securing the paper changed nothing. The truth was already lodged in her mind. She couldn't unsee what she had read. She couldn't pretend the report didn't exist. And she couldn't ignore the possibility that someone, somewhere, had decided it was time for this information to surface. The silence in the palace felt different now. The grand rooms and long hallways that had always represented stability and tradition suddenly seemed heavy with secrets. Anne looked out the window at the carefully maintained gardens, the perfect hedges and manicured lawns that symbolized the order and control the monarchy prided itself on. But that order now felt fragile. One document, one DNA test, one hidden truth, and everything could unravel. She had always believed in duty, in service, in putting the institution above personal feelings. But this situation demanded something more than blind loyalty. This was about a person, someone with Diana's blood, who had apparently been denied their place in the family. It was about Diana herself, a woman who had died tragically and whose story, it now appeared, had never been fully told. Anne sat in silence, wrestling with what to do next. She couldn't simply ignore the report, but she also couldn't rush forward without understanding the full picture. Somewhere out there was a person connected to Diana, someone the palace had either never known about or had deliberately hidden. And whoever had sent this envelope to her wanted her to know. They had chosen her specifically, trusted her with information that could shake the monarchy to its core. The weight of that trust settled on her shoulders. Anne had spent her life being the steady one, the reliable royal who never caused problems. But nothing in her years of service had prepared her for this moment. She was being asked, or perhaps forced, to decide between protecting the institution and pursuing the truth. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't certain which path to take. Anne couldn't shake the feeling that Diana had left behind more than just memories. In the days following the discovery of the DNA report, she found herself revisiting conversations and moments she had previously dismissed as insignificant. Diana had always been expressive, emotional, someone who wore her heart openly in a family that prized restraint. But now Anne wondered if some of those emotions had masked deliberate attempts to communicate something deeper. Diana's diaries had been a source of fascination and controversy for years. Some had been published, others remained locked away in private collections. Anne recalled the few times Diana had shared passages with her, moments of rare vulnerability when the two women had found themselves alone. Diana had been protective of those writings, treating them as sacred territory. At the time, Anne had assumed they were simply the outpourings of a troubled soul, a woman processing her difficult position within the royal family. But certain phrases now echoed in her mind with new meaning. Diana had written about truths too dangerous to speak aloud. She had mentioned leaving a map for someone who would understand. Anne had read these lines as poetic language, the kind of dramatic expression that came naturally to Diana. But what if they had been literal? What if Diana had actually been creating a trail of evidence, knowing that one day someone would need to follow it? The letters Diana had written to trusted friends and confidants took on new significance. Anne began to quietly reach out to a few individuals she knew Diana had been close to, people outside the immediate royal circle, who might have received communications that were more candid than what Diana could risk sharing within palace walls. The conversations were delicate, carefully worded to avoid revealing too much, but patterns began to emerge. Diana had indeed hinted at something, a betrayal that went beyond the well-documented infidelity in her marriage. She had spoken of blood, of family, of secrets that cut to the very core of who she was. One letter in particular, written in the final years of Diana's life, contained a line that Anne couldn't forget. Diana had written about keeping someone safe, about making choices that tore at her heart but seemed necessary for protection. She had mentioned wanting her sons to understand one day, but also fearing they might never get the chance to know the full truth. The words had seemed melodramatic when Anne first heard about them. Now they felt like a confession. Armed with this new context, Anne made the decision to dig deeper into the archives. Not the official royal records, which she knew would be sanitized and controlled, but other sources. She enlisted the help of a trusted aide, someone who had worked for the family long enough to understand the gravity of sensitive information. She gave them the initials from the DNA report and asked them to search through everything they could access, including restricted collections that few people ever saw. What came back was deeply disturbing. Large portions of records from the late 1980s had been altered. Dates didn't align properly. Hospital entries contained inconsistencies that couldn't be explained by pies. Simple clerical errors. Names had been crossed out or redacted in ways that suggested deliberate intervention rather than routine privacy protection. Someone had gone through these documents systematically, removing or changing information to hide something significant. The aide eventually found a lead in a small European clinic, far from London and the watchful eyes of the British press. There was a notation in an old medical ledger, barely visible, easy to miss unless you were specifically looking for it. The entry recorded a birth that had never been registered in official British records. The timing aligned perfectly with a period when Diana had made several unexplained trips abroad, journeys that had been described at the time as personal retreats or private charitable work. What made this discovery even more striking was the identity of the attending physician. The doctor had once worked closely with the royal family, serving in a trusted capacity for several years. But this person had resigned suddenly, with only vague explanations about personal reasons given for the departure. No one had questioned it at the time. Royal staff came and went, and resignations were usually handled with discretion. But the timing of this particular departure, coming just after the birth recorded in that European clinic, seemed too coincidental to ignore. Anne cross-referenced the dates of Diana's overseas trips with what her aide had uncovered. The alignment was almost perfect. Every time Diana had disappeared from the public schedule for a few days, claiming she needed rest or time away, it corresponded with activity connected to this hidden medical record. What the palace and the press had accepted as routine breaks from royal duties now appeared to be something entirely different. Diana had been maintaining contact with someone, visiting someone, caring for someone the world knew nothing about. The whispers about a third child had circulated for years in certain corners of the tabloid press and online forums. Most people within royal circles had dismissed these rumors as baseless conspiracy theories, the kind of wild speculation that always surrounded high-profile figures. Anne herself had considered them absurd, offensive even, given how much Diana had already suffered from media intrusion. But the evidence now suggested that some of those whispers might have been rooted in truth. As Anne pieced together the timeline, a larger picture emerged. This wasn't a child born from a brief affair or a youthful mistake. The pattern of Diana's visits, the care taken to keep everything hidden, the involvement of a trusted royal physician, all of it suggested something more complex. Someone with power and resources had orchestrated an elaborate cover-up, and that cover-up had held for decades, surviving even Diana's death and the intense scrutiny that followed. Anne realized with growing certainty that she needed to confront Charles directly. If anyone knew the Clicksigo full truth, it would be him. She found him alone one evening in his study, a room lined with books and paintings, a space where he often retreated to think. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She placed the DNA report on his desk and watched his face carefully. His reaction told her everything. There was no shock, no confusion, no demand to know where she had gotten such a document. Instead, Charles simply looked at the paper with a kind of tired recognition. His expression carried the weight of someone who had been carrying a burden for a very long time, and had perhaps always known this moment would eventually arrive. When he finally met her eyes, Anne saw something she had rarely witnessed in her brother, an unguarded moment of truth. She demanded answers. She asked him directly if he had known about this child, if he had been part of hiding the truth. Charles didn't deny it. He didn't try to deflect or claim ignorance. Instead, he confirmed what Anne had already begun to suspect. Yes, he had known. Yes, the child was real. And yes, after Diana's death, decisions had been made to keep that reality buried. He spoke about it in measured terms, framing everything as a necessary choice made during a time of crisis. After Diana died, he explained, there had been chaos, the public mourning, the questions about the circumstances of her death, the intense scrutiny of the royal family. In the midst of all that, certain people had argued that revealing the existence of another child would create a constitutional disaster. The monarchy was already under enormous pressure. Adding another scandal, another complication to the line of succession, might have been the breaking point. So a decision had been made. Records were sealed. The few people who knew were persuaded or pressured into silence. The child, already living away from public view, would remain there. It was presented to Charles as protecting the institution, safeguarding the crown for future generations. He had gone along with it, believing, or perhaps needing to believe, that it was the right choice. Anne listened with growing anger. She had stood by Charles through countless difficulties. She had defended the family when others criticized them. She had believed that despite their flaws, they operated with a basic level of honesty among themselves. But this revelation shattered that belief. Charles had participated in erasing someone from history, someone with Diana's blood, and he had lived with that decision for years without ever telling her. Her fury wasn't just about the deception, it was about what it meant for Diana. Her sister-in-law had lived through so much pain, so much public judgment, so much private struggle. And now Anne understood that Diana had carried an additional burden, a secret child she couldn't acknowledge, a truth she couldn't speak. The institution Diana had called the machine had done exactly what she feared. It had silenced her, controlled her story, and made sure that even in death, parts of her truth remained hidden. Charles tried to justify it further, talking about duty and the survival of the monarchy. He spoke about difficult choices that people outside the family could never understand. But his words rang hollow to Anne. This wasn't about duty, it was about control. It was about protecting an image at the expense of a human being who deserved to be acknowledged. As she left Charles's study that evening, Anne knew the situation was even more complicated than she had imagined. Her brother had confirmed the worst. But if Charles had known, who else had been part of this conspiracy? And more importantly, who else might still be using this secret for their own purposes? The answer to that question would lead her to someone who had mastered the art of turning information into power. If Charles had been complicit in burying the truth, Anne knew there was one other person who likely held pieces of this puzzle. Camilla had spent years carefully positioning herself within the royal family, navigating scandals and public opinion with a strategic patience that few fully appreciated. She had survived situations that would have destroyed others, not through confrontation, but through careful management of information and relationships. Anne suspected that if there was a secret this significant, Camilla would have found a way to know about it. The confrontation happened in one of the private sitting rooms at Clarence's house. Anne didn't announce her visit or give Camilla time to prepare. She simply arrived and made it clear they needed to talk. When she laid out what she had discovered, the DNA evidence, the hidden records, the European clinic, Camilla's response was notably calm. There was no surprise, no denial, no attempt to claim ignorance. Instead, she listened with the composed attention of someone hearing information they already possessed. When Camilla finally spoke, her tone was almost conversational. She acknowledged that, yes, she had known about Diana's hidden child for quite some time. She hadn't learned about it from Charles directly, at least not initially. Instead, she had pieced it together through her own careful observations and discreet inquiries. Camilla explained that information within palace circles was never truly secret. It simply moved through different channels. passed between trusted individuals, held close by those who understood its value. She described how she had gathered fragments of the truth over years. A comment overheard here, a nervous reaction to certain questions there, small inconsistencies in official stories that didn't quite add up. Camila had a talent for collecting these pieces and assembling them into a complete picture. And this particular picture, she admitted, was the most valuable information she had ever obtained. What shocked Anne most was how matter-of-fact Camila was about the entire situation. She didn't express regret or concern about the hidden child. She didn't seem troubled by the deception or the impact on Diana's legacy. Instead, she spoke about it as a strategic asset. She explained that knowing this secret had given her a certain protection within the family structure. It was an unspoken card she held, something that made her position more secure because people understood, without it ever being directly stated, that she possessed information that could cause serious damage if it ever became public. Anne's outrage flared. She accused Camila of treating a human life, Diana's child, as nothing more than a bargaining chip in palace politics. But Camila remained unruffled. She pointed out that everyone in their world operated with secrets and leverage. The only difference was that she was willing to acknowledge it openly, at least in this private conversation. She suggested that Anne's anger came from finally seeing how things actually worked, rather than how Anne had preferred to believe they worked. Then Camila shifted the conversation in a more threatening direction. She reminded Anne that the monarchy's stability rested on carefully managed perceptions. The public needed to believe in certain narratives about the royal family, and those narratives could be disrupted not just by revelations about Diana's hidden child, but by other truths as well. She made veiled references to Anne's own past, suggesting there were aspects of her personal life that had been kept private through the same mechanisms of discretion and control that protected everyone in the family. The implication was clear. If Anne pushed too hard on this issue, if she tried to expose the truth about Diana's child, Camila was prepared to make things very uncomfortable for her. It wasn't a loud threat or an aggressive warning. It was delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where the power lay and how to use it. But then Camila said something that changed everything. As she concluded their conversation, she made a casual comment that the child Diana had hidden wasn't some distant, unreachable figure lost to history. He was alive, she said, and closer than Anne might think. The words were delivered almost as an afterthought, but they carried enormous weight. Camila knew where he was. She had been keeping track of him, and that knowledge gave her yet another layer of control over the situation. Anne left that meeting shaken but more determined than ever. Camilla's threats didn't intimidate her as much as they might have in the past. What mattered now was finding this person, Diana's son, and understanding his story directly. She couldn't rely on Charles's version or Camilla's strategic perspective. She needed to know the truth from someone who had lived it. She intensified her private investigation, working with discreet contacts outside the official royal channels. She reached out to archivists in Europe, people who maintained historical records independent of British governmental oversight. These individuals had access to documentation that hadn't been scrubbed or altered by palace officials. Through weeks of careful searching, a picture began to emerge. They found records of a birth in a small clinic, just as the earlier investigation had suggested, but now they had more details. A name, though it was clearly fabricated, chosen specifically to be unremarkable and forgettable. The birth certificate listed no father, and the mother's information was partially redacted, but the date and location aligned perfectly with Diana's known whereabouts during that period. Medical records, fragmentary as they were, confirmed that a child had been born and subsequently disappeared into a life far removed from royal scrutiny. Then the photographs began to surface. Old images, carefully preserved by people who had known to keep them safe. The first time Anne saw one, she felt her breath catch. The resemblance to Diana was unmistakable. The shape of the face, the eyes, even certain expressions captured in candid moments, all of it echoed the sister-in-law she had known. There were similarities to Harry as well. More than to William, a particular intensity in the gaze that matched the younger of Diana's acknowledged sons. These weren't professional portraits or formal photographs. They were the kind of images that documented an ordinary life. A young boy at school, a teenager on a beach somewhere, a young man graduating from university. Each photograph showed someone growing up completely outside the royal bubble, living a normal existence that would have been impossible had his true parentage been known. Yet the features that marked him as Diana's son were there for anyone who knew to look. Anne also gained access to some of Diana's later letters, correspondence that had been held by a trusted confidant who had promised to keep them private until the right moment. These letters painted a more complete picture of Diana's relationship with this hidden child. She wrote about secret meetings, carefully arranged visits that had to be disguised as other activities. She described the pain of not being able to claim him publicly, of watching him grow up at a distance, of knowing that the world celebrated her as a mother to 2 sons while never knowing about the third. Diana's words revealed a woman torn between her desire to protect this child from the crushing weight of royal expectations and her yearning to bring him into her acknowledged family. She wrote about the impossible choices she faced, the constant fear that the truth would emerge in a way that would harm him rather than help him. Her letters expressed hope that one day, when the time was right, he would be able to step forward on his own terms. But they also carried an undercurrent of fear that she might not live to see that day. The most significant discovery was that this man knew exactly who he was. He had been aware of his identity for years, possibly since adolescence. Letters he had written to one of Diana's confidants confirmed that he had pieced together the truth through a combination of direct information Diana had shared with him and his own investigation. But he had chosen to remain silent. He hadn't reached out to William or Harry. He hadn't attempted to claim any royal privilege or position. He had simply lived his life, carrying the knowledge of his parentage quietly. Anne tried to understand why he had made that choice. Perhaps it was loyalty to Diana, honoring her decision to keep him protected. Perhaps it was a desire to avoid the chaos that revelation would bring. Or perhaps, having watched from a distance how the royal family operated, he simply wanted no part of it. Whatever his reasons, his silence had been deliberate and sustained. But his existence, regardless of his own choices, represented something profound. He was living proof that the official story of Diana's life was incomplete. His bloodline made him a direct challenge to the carefully maintained order of succession. Even if he had no personal ambitions toward royal status, the simple fact of his existence complicated questions about legitimacy and lineage that the monarchy had spent centuries trying to keep clear and unambiguous. Anne realized that this had moved beyond a historical investigation. This was about a real person, living in the present, carrying Diana's legacy in ways the world had never been allowed to see. The weight of that understanding pressed on her. She thought about Diana's final wishes, about the breadcrumbs she had left, about the trust she had placed in someone eventually finding and following them. Anne understood now that she was meant to be that someone. The moment came when arrangements were made for a meeting. It had to be completely private, away from any possibility of observation or documentation. No staff, no security beyond the absolute minimum, no official record that it was happening. When the day arrived, Anne found herself more nervous than she had been in years. She was about to come face to face with a truth that had been hidden for decades, and she had no idea how it would feel to look into the eyes of Diana's forgotten son. The meeting took place in a location far from London, carefully chosen for its privacy and distance from anyone who might recognize either of them. Anne arrived early, her mind racing through everything she had learned over the past weeks. All the documents, the photographs, the letters. They had prepared her intellectually for this moment. But nothing could truly prepare her for the emotional reality of meeting someone who carried Diana's blood and had been denied any acknowledgement of that fact. When he entered the room, the impact was immediate. Anne had seen the photographs, had studied his features, had convinced herself she was ready. But seeing him in person was entirely different. The resemblance to Diana wasn't just physical. There was something in the way he carried himself, a certain gentleness mixed with wariness, that reminded her powerfully of the woman she had known. His eyes, in particular, held that same quality Diana had possessed, a depth that suggested both strength and an awareness of pain. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of decades of silence hung between them. Anne, who had spent her entire life maintaining royal composure, found herself struggling to find the right words. This wasn't a diplomatic encounter or an official meeting. This was deeply intensely personal. Finally, he broke the silence, thanking her quietly for agreeing to meet with him. His voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of emotion that matched her own. He began to tell his story, and Anne listened without interruption. He described his childhood in Europe, far from the media spotlight that followed his half-brothers. He had been raised by people who cared for him, who had been trusted by Diana to give him as normal a life as possible. He spoke about growing up with a sense that something about his identity was being kept from him, pieces that didn't quite fit together in the story he had been told. As he got older, the truth had gradually been revealed to him. Diana had left letters for him, passed through intermediaries, explaining who she was and why their relationship had to remain hidden. He described reading those letters as a young man, trying to process the reality that his mother was one of the most famous women in the world, someone he could only watch from a distance. He had seen her on television, in newspapers and magazines, celebrated globally while he remained invisible. The most difficult part, he explained, had been the night Diana died. He had been told about the accident like everyone else, through news reports, but unlike the millions who mourned a public figure, he had lost his mother, and he couldn't even grieve openly. There was no funeral for him to attend, no public acknowledgement of his loss. He had watched William and Harry walk behind the coffin, had seen the world's sympathy pour out for them, all while his own connection to her remained a secret he was bound to keep. Over the years, he had pieced together more of the story. He understood why Diana had made the choices she did, why she had kept him separate from the royal family. He didn't blame her for it. In fact, he respected her decision, recognizing that she had been trying to protect him from the very pressures and scrutiny that had made her own life so difficult. But that understanding didn't eliminate the pain of being a secret, of knowing he had siblings who didn't know he existed, of watching from the shadows as the story of Diana's life was told without his chapter included. What struck Anne most deeply was his lack of bitterness. He wasn't angry at the royal family, at least not in any obvious way. He wasn't demanding recognition or seeking revenge for having been hidden. He simply wanted his existence acknowledged as truth. He wanted Diana's full story to be told, including the parts that had been deliberately erased. He spoke about her with obvious love and respect, defending the choices she had made even when those choices had caused him pain. Anne found herself overwhelmed. She had approached this investigation as a matter of uncovering facts, of following evidence to its logical conclusion. But sitting across from this man, hearing his story in his own words, she understood the profound human cost of the deception that had been maintained. This wasn't just about bloodlines or succession or constitutional questions. It was about a person who had been denied his place in his own family's history. She thought about Diana in those final years, carrying the weight of this secret alongside all her other struggles. The public had seen her charitable work, her difficulties with the palace, her relationship with her sons, but they had never known about this additional burden, the child she loved but couldn't claim. Anne felt tears gathering as she understood more fully what Diana had endured and why she had left those breadcrumbs, those clues, scattered through diaries and letters. She had been trying to ensure that eventually, someone would find the truth and give her son what she couldn't provide herself. At that moment, Anne made a decision that went against everything she had been trained to do as a member of the royal family. The institution had taught her to protect the monarchy above all else, to maintain the carefully constructed image, to keep family matters private. But sitting there with Diana's son, she realized that some truths were more important than institutional preservation. Diana deserved to have her full story told. This man deserved to have his existence acknowledged. And she, Anne, was in a position to make that happen. She made him a promise. She told him that she would not let Diana's secret remain buried, that the world would know the truth, not as scandal or gossip, but as a legitimate part of royal history that had been wrongfully hidden. She promised to stand with him when that truth came out, to face whatever consequences arose from breaking decades of silence. It was a vow that she knew would set her against Charles, against Camila, against the very institution she had served faithfully her entire life. But in that moment, sitting across from Diana's forgotten son, she knew it was the right thing to do. The decision to go public wasn't made lightly or quickly. Anne spent days wrestling with the implications, knowing that once she took this step, there would be no going back.